I found out my parents weren't coming to my graduation while I was standing in line, wearing a borrowed cap that smelled like someone else's sweat, listening to a staff member mispronounce my name through a crackling microphone. The gym was packed with families clutching balloons and phones, everyone scanning the bleachers for familiar faces. I already knew exactly where my parents were supposed to be sitting because my mother had asked for the seat numbers weeks earlier, had made a point of it, had texted me to double-check the time zone even though we all lived in the same state. I kept glancing up there anyway, my neck tight, my jaw clenched, pretending I wasn't counting empty seats. When my phone buzzed in my pocket, I assumed it was them saying they were running late. Instead, it was a single text from my father that said, "Something came up. We won't make it. Congrats." No punctuation after congrats, no apology, no explanation. Just that. I remember the sound of the crowd swelling around me as if someone had turned the volume knob up all at once, the smell of rubber flooring and perfume and popcorn making my stomach flip. I didn't cry. I didn't react at all. I just stood there while the line moved forward, thinking that whatever something had come up had apparently mattered more than the moment I had been working toward for years. I walked across the stage anyway. I shook the dean's hand. I smiled when the photographer pointed at me. From the outside, I probably looked like every other graduate, another face in a sea of caps and gowns. Inside, it felt like something had finally settled into place, something heavy and permanent. I had known for a long time that my parents had favorites. I had known where I ranked. But this was different. This was public. This was undeniable. When I walked back to my seat and the applause faded into the general noise of the ceremony, I looked again at the bleachers, at the rows of families hugging and waving, and I understood that whatever relationship I thought I still had with my parents existed mostly in my head. The ceremony ended in a rush of chaos. People spilled out onto the lawn, posing for photos, laughing, crying, shouting names. I stood off to the side with my phone in my hand, watching my classmates get swallowed by their families. I told myself I didn't need anyone there. I told myself I was used to this. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a congratulations. It was a message from my mother, sent less than an hour after the ceremony ended. "We need to talk tonight," it read. "It's important." There was no acknowledgement of the fact that they had missed my graduation, no recognition of what that might have meant to me. Just a demand. I stared at the screen, feeling a familiar irritation bloom in my chest, the kind that came from years of conversations that were never actually conversations, only instructions. I didn't respond right away. I drove home alone, still in my cap and gown, the tassels slapping against my cheek every time I turned my head. When I pulled into my apartment complex, I sat in the car for a while, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, thinking about how this place, small and cheap as it was, felt more like home than the house I had grown up in ever had. I finally texted back that I could talk later. My mother responded immediately with a thumbs-up emoji as if we were discussing dinner plans. When they called that evening, I put the phone on speaker and set it down on the table in front of me. I didn't trust myself to hold it. My mother did most of the talking. She said they were proud of me. She said they wished they could have been there. She said my father had been stressed lately, that things had been complicated. Then she shifted gears so smoothly it was almost impressive. She explained that they were in a bind, that an unexpected expense had come up, that they needed help. She said the number casually, like it was nothing, like she was asking to borrow a cup of sugar. $2,100. She said it would only be temporary. She said family helps family. I didn't answer right away. I asked what the expense was. There was a pause. My father cleared his throat. My mother said it wasn't important. I said it mattered to me. She sighed, the exaggerated kind of sigh she used when she wanted me to feel unreasonable. She said it was for my sister. She said she needed help with something related to her business, that it was an investment, really. I thought about my sister, about the way my parents talked about her with a softness they had never used for me, about the way they had supported her ventures with money and time and praise. I thought about the empty seats at my graduation. I said no. The silence on the line was immediate and sharp. My mother's voice changed first. She said she didn't understand why I was being difficult. She reminded me of everything they had done for me growing up. He said this was the least I could do. I told her calmly that I wasn't comfortable giving them that much money, that I had my own expenses, that I had just graduated and was still getting on my feet. My father jumped in then, his voice louder, angrier. He said I was being selfish. He said I owed them. He said they had expected better from me. I told them again that my answer was no. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult them. I just repeated it. That's when my mother said something that made my stomach drop. She said if I didn't help them, they would have no choice but to take action. I asked her what she meant. She said she didn't want to say it, but they could involve the police. She said it like she was doing me a favor by warning me. I laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, and asked what exactly they planned to tell the police. My father said they would explain that I was withholding money that belonged to them, that there were records, that it wouldn't look good for me. I told them they were welcome to try. The call ended shortly after that, my mother telling me she was disappointed in me one last time before hanging up. I sat there for a long time after the line went dead, staring at the dark screen of my phone. I thought about how surreal it was that on the day I graduated, the day I had proven to myself that I could make it through something hard on my own, my parents had chosen to threaten me instead of celebrate me. I didn't know yet how far they were willing to go, or how public they were about to make it. All I knew was that something had shifted and there was no going back to pretending things were fine. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the empty seats in the bleachers, then my mother's name lighting up my phone, then the word police hanging in the air like a threat that didn't make sense but still felt heavy. By morning, I had that familiar hollowed-out feeling behind my ribs, the one that used to show up when I was younger and had done something my parents didn't approve of, even when I couldn't figure out what rule I had broken. I went through my day on autopilot, answering congratulatory messages from friends and distant relatives who had seen the graduation photos online, typing out thank yous that felt disconnected from the reality of how the day had actually ended. I didn't mention my parents. I never did. There was an unspoken rule I had learned early: protect the family image even when it hurt. Around noon, my sister posted on social media. It was a photo of her sitting in a cafe, laptop open, iced coffee in hand, sunlight catching her hair just right. The caption talked about exciting new beginnings and big things coming. I stared at it longer than I should have, thinking about the $2,100 my parents said she needed, thinking about how easily the money seemed to flow toward her ambitions while mine had always been framed as indulgent or risky. When I was in school, every tuition payment had come with a lecture. Every book I bought was questioned. When my sister decided to start her business, my parents had written checks without hesitation and bragged about her entrepreneurial spirit to anyone who would listen. That afternoon my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a call. It was a text from an unknown number. It said, "This is Officer Reynolds. Please contact me regarding a complaint filed by your parents." I read it twice, then a third time, my hands going cold. Part of me still couldn't believe they had actually done it. I had half convinced myself the threat was just another manipulation tactic, something they would use to scare me into compliance and then quietly drop when it didn't work. Seeing it spelled out like that with an officer's name attached made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't prepared for. I called the number back. The officer was polite, almost apologetic. He said my parents had come into the station that morning claiming I was withholding money that belonged to them, that there had been an agreement, that they were worried I was going to disappear with it. He said he needed to hear my side of the story. I asked him if this was a criminal matter. He hesitated, then said it sounded more like a civil dispute, but that he was obligated to follow up. He asked if I could come down to the station to talk in person. Walking into the police station felt unreal. I had never been in trouble before. I kept thinking about how it would look if someone I knew saw me there, about how easily rumors start, about how my parents had always been careful to present themselves as respectable, generous people. I wondered what they had said about me, what picture they had painted. When I sat down across from Officer Reynolds, I told him the truth. I told him there was no agreement, no money I was holding for them, no reason for their claim. I told him about the call the night before, about the request, about my refusal. I didn't embellish. I didn't editorialize. I just laid it out step by step. He listened, nodding occasionally, asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. He said he suspected as much. He said my parents hadn't been able to provide any documentation to support their claim. He said this kind of situation, while unfortunate, wasn't uncommon. He assured me I wasn't in trouble. He said he would document my statement and likely close the matter unless new information came to light. The relief I felt was immediate but incomplete, like taking a breath after being underwater and realizing you still have to swim to shore. As I was leaving, my phone rang. It was my mother. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message anyway. Her voice was tight, controlled, the way it got when she was trying not to sound angry. She said she hoped I understood the seriousness of what I had done. She said involving the police wasn't something they wanted, but I had left them no choice. She said this was my last opportunity to do the right thing. I deleted the voicemail without responding. That evening, word started to spread. An aunt called to ask why my parents were so upset. A cousin texted me saying she had heard there was some kind of legal thing going on. I realized my parents weren't keeping this quiet. They were telling their version of the story to anyone who would listen, framing themselves as worried, wronged, forced into action by an ungrateful child. I felt exposed, like my private life had been dragged into the open without my consent. At the same time, there was a strange sense of clarity. For the first time, their behavior was so extreme, so clearly unreasonable, that it was harder to blame myself. I started thinking back over the years, noticing patterns I had ignored or minimized. The way my achievements were always compared to my sisters, usually unfavorably. The way my independence had been framed as distance, while hers was celebrated as confidence. The way my parents had always seemed more comfortable when I needed them than when I didn't. I remembered being a teenager and getting a part-time job, how my mother had complained that I was acting like I didn't need family anymore. I remembered my father telling me I was too sensitive whenever I tried to talk about how their words affected me. The next day my sister called. She didn't mention the police. She didn't mention my graduation. She asked how I was doing in a tone that suggested she already knew the answer and didn't really want to hear it. I told her I was fine. She paused, then said Mom and Dad were under a lot of stress, that I should try to be understanding. She said the money would really help her, that it was an opportunity she couldn't miss. I asked her if she knew they had gone to the police. There was another pause, longer this time. She said they had mentioned it, yes, but that they hadn't meant it maliciously. She said they were just desperate. I told her I wasn't giving them the money. She said she was disappointed. The call ended shortly after. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the quiet pressing in around me. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a rough patch or a temporary lapse in judgment. This was who my parents were when they didn't get what they wanted. And I was on my own. At least that's how it felt then. I didn't yet see the leverage I had been quietly building for years, the ways my life had grown beyond their control. All I could see was the fallout spreading outward, and the sense that I was about to be tested in ways I hadn't anticipated. In the days that followed, the narrative my parents were pushing hardened into something almost official, like a script they had rehearsed together. I started hearing it repeated back to me in fragments through other people's voices. An uncle told me my parents were worried about me making reckless decisions. A family friend asked if I was having money problems and needed guidance. Someone else hinted that graduation stress can make people act out, as if saying no to a demand was some kind of breakdown. Each time I felt that same old pull to explain myself, to correct the record, to prove that I wasn't the unstable one in this situation. And each time I stopped. I answered vaguely, thanked them for their concern, and changed the subject. It was exhausting, but it was also the first boundary I had ever managed to hold without immediately apologizing for it. What made it harder was that my parents didn't confront me directly anymore. They didn't call to yell or threaten. They went quiet in that deliberate, strategic way that had always unnerved me more than open anger. Silence in our family was never neutral. It was a weapon. It meant they were waiting for me to crack, waiting for the discomfort to push me back into line. When I didn't reach out, when I didn't send a message trying to smooth things over, the pressure shifted outward. My mother started calling relatives more frequently. My father made vague posts online about loyalty and respect. My sister shared another update about her business, this time thanking our parents for their unwavering support. I read it and felt something tighten behind my eyes, not quite tears, more like the ache of recognition. I kept going to work, kept showing up, kept pretending that my life wasn't being quietly rearranged without my consent. I had started my job months before graduation, a position I'd landed on my own after a long, discouraging search. My parents had barely acknowledged it at the time, only asking whether it paid well enough and if it would interfere with family obligations. Now I realized they didn't really know anything about it. They didn't know what I did day to day, didn't know my schedule, didn't know the people I worked with. That ignorance, once a source of pain, began to feel like insulation. One afternoon, about a week after the police incident, My mother showed up at my apartment without warning. I saw her car from the window and felt my stomach drop, my body reacting before my mind had caught up. She knocked, sharp and insistent. I didn't open the door right away. I stood there, listening, reminding myself that I was an adult, that she couldn't ground me or take my phone or demand explanations just because she was my mother. When I finally opened the door, she looked me up and down, taking in my space with a critical eye. She didn't comment on the congratulations cards still stacked on the counter or the diploma folder on the table. She stepped inside as if she owned the place. She said she wanted to talk. I told her we could talk, but she couldn't stay long. Her lips tightened at that, but she sat down anyway. She told me they were hurt. She said they couldn't believe I would embarrass them like this. I asked how I had embarrassed them. She said by forcing them to involve the police, by making them look like bad parents. I pointed out calmly that they had chosen to do that. She waved it away. She said I was focusing on the wrong details. She said the real issue was that I had changed, that I was cold now, distant. She said ever since I started thinking I was independent, I had forgotten who was really there for me. I listened without interrupting, something I had learned to do years ago. When she finished, I told her I hadn't changed as much as she thought. I told her I was just finally saying what I meant. I told her I wasn't giving them the money and I wasn't discussing it anymore. She stared at me, her expression shifting from practiced disappointment to something sharper. She asked me how I thought this would end. She asked me if I really wanted to alienate my family over money. I told her it wasn't about the money. She laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and said it always was. Before she left, she said something that stuck with me. She said I should be careful, that people who burn bridges often regret it when they realize how alone they are. I didn't respond. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it, my heart pounding, my hands shaking just enough that I noticed. I had stood my ground, but it didn't feel triumphant. It felt like standing on the edge of something, not knowing how far the drop was. That night, I went through old emails and documents, partly out of anxiety, partly out of a need to anchor myself in something concrete. I looked at my lease, my bank statements, my employment contract. I realized how much of my life was already separate from my parents, how few actual ties remained beyond emotional ones. I thought about the way they had spoken to the police, about the confidence with which they had accused me of wrongdoing. It occurred to me then that their certainty came from habit. They were used to being believed. Used to being deferred to. Used to me backing down. The next call came not from my parents but from my father's brother. He asked if we could talk privately. When we met for coffee, he was careful, choosing his words like they might cut him if handled poorly. He said my parents were very upset. He said they felt betrayed. He asked me gently what was really going on. I told him everything. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't soften it. I told him about the graduation, the request, the threat, the police. He listened, his brow furrowed, his mouth set in a line I couldn't read. When I finished, he sighed and said that wasn't how he'd heard it. He said he needed to think. As I walked home afterward, I felt a strange mix of dread and relief. I knew this conversation and others like it would start to shift the balance. The story my parents were telling couldn't survive too much daylight. At the same time, I was aware of how fragile my position still felt. I had no idea how far they were willing to go, how much pressure they could bring to bear. I still felt in many ways like the kid I used to be, bracing for punishment, waiting for consequences. What I didn't yet fully understand was that the leverage they had relied on for years was already slipping through their fingers, replaced by something quieter, sturdier, built slowly and without their involvement. By the time the second week after graduation rolled around, the tension had settled into my routine like background noise, constant but strangely manageable. I woke up, went to work, came home, cooked simple meals, answered messages selectively. On the surface, nothing dramatic was happening anymore. Underneath, everything felt provisional, like I was living in a house during an earthquake lull, aware that another jolt could come at any moment. My parents still hadn't contacted me directly since my mother's visit, but their presence lingered in indirect ways. A cousin mentioned that my father was considering legal options. An old family friend sent a long message about forgiveness and gratitude that read like it had been dictated. Each time I felt that familiar spike of anxiety, followed by a steadier, quieter resolve. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't defend myself. I let the silence do its work. What surprised me most was how little my parents actually knew about my life at this point. They spoke with confidence about my finances, my stability, my supposed dependence on them, but none of it lined up with reality. I had been careful for years, saving quietly, building credit, keeping my plans to myself because every time I shared something hopeful with them, it somehow turned into leverage. When I moved out, they had framed it as temporary, something I would eventually reverse. When I stopped asking for advice, they assumed I had nothing to say. That assumption was now working in my favor. One evening, as I was sorting through paperwork, I came across the email confirming the bonus I'd received at work earlier that year, the one I hadn't mentioned to anyone in my family. It wasn't a life-changing amount, but it had been enough to pad my savings and give me breathing room. I thought about how differently that money had been treated compared to the $2,100 my parents wanted. My money had come with effort, negotiation, restraint. Their request had come with entitlement and threat. Seeing it laid out like that clarified something for me. This wasn't a crisis. It was a test. The next escalation came in the form of a certified letter. I found the slip in my mailbox after work and felt my pulse quicken before I even read the sender's name. It was from a small law office I recognized vaguely, one my parents had used years earlier for a property dispute. The letter itself was heavy on legal language and light on substance. It claimed there was an outstanding financial obligation, referenced a verbal agreement, and requested that I respond within 10 days. There were no specifics, no evidence, just the implied threat of formal action. I sat at my kitchen table and read it twice, then a third time, noticing how carefully vague it was. For the first time since all this began, I felt something close to anger rather than fear. Not the explosive kind, but a focused, narrowing heat. They weren't just trying to scare me anymore. They were trying to rewrite reality. I called a lawyer the next morning, one recommended by a coworker who knew nothing about my family situation, only that I wanted a consultation. Sitting in that office, explaining everything from the graduation onward, I felt oddly calm. The lawyer listened, asked questions, flipped through the letter. When I finished, she leaned back and said what my parents were attempting had no real standing. She said verbal agreements of that nature were notoriously difficult to prove, especially without any supporting documentation. She said if anything, their actions bordered on harassment. Hearing that from someone detached, someone with no emotional investment, shifted something in me. For weeks I had been reacting, bracing, absorbing. Now for the first time I was seeing the situation from the outside. I authorized her to send a response on my behalf, a short, firm letter denying any obligation and requesting that all further communication go through her office. When I left, the air outside felt lighter, like I'd stepped out from under a low ceiling without realizing how hunched I'd been. The fallout was immediate, though not in the way I expected. My sister called that evening, her tone sharper than before. She accused me of overreacting, of turning a family issue into a legal one. She said Mom was crying, that Dad felt disrespected. I told her calmly that they had involved the police first, then a lawyer. I told her I was protecting myself. She said I was being dramatic. I asked her if she would give them $2,100 without question. She didn't answer. Instead, she said I had always been jealous, that I couldn't stand seeing her succeed. That one stung, not because it was true, but because I recognized it as something my parents must have said to her, a narrative passed down and polished. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet and let myself feel the grief I'd been postponing. Not just for the relationship I wished I had with my parents, but for the one I had thought I had with my sister. I realized how often I had absorbed blame to keep the peace, how often I had minimized my own needs to avoid being labeled difficult. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me tired in a clean, clarifying way. A few days later, my uncle called again. He said my parents were furious about the lawyer's letter. He said they felt attacked. He also said more quietly that other relatives were starting to ask questions. The police visit, the certified letter, the legal response. It didn't fit the image my parents liked to project. He didn't say he was taking sides, but he didn't need to. The fact that he was calling me, asking for my perspective again, was telling. I hung up and looked around my apartment at the life I had built piece by piece, largely unseen by the people who claimed the most authority over it. I still didn't feel powerful. I still felt exposed in some ways. But beneath that there was a growing steadiness. For years my parents' influence had come from my willingness to doubt myself. Now that doubt was eroding, replaced by documentation, witnesses, and the simple truth of my own experience. Whatever came next, I knew one thing with certainty. I wasn't powerless anymore, even if I hadn't yet seen how that shift would finally force everything into the open. The response from my lawyer didn't end things the way a part of me had hoped it might. There was no sudden silence, no moment where my parents realized they'd gone too far and backed off. Instead, the pressure changed shape. It became subtler, more social, less official on paper but heavier in the spaces between conversations. Invitations stopped coming. Group chats went quiet when I spoke. I noticed relatives who used to comment on my posts scrolling past without acknowledgement. It was the kind of ostracism that could be denied if confronted, the kind that let everyone involved tell themselves they were being neutral. I told myself I didn't care. Most days that was almost true. What I hadn't expected was how much my parents would lean into being wronged. They didn't just frame themselves as disappointed or confused anymore. They were victims now. My mother told anyone who would listen that she was losing sleep over me, that she didn't recognize her own child. My father hinted that I was being manipulated by outside influences, a phrase he'd always used when something didn't go his way. The story grew more elaborate with each retelling, smoothing over inconvenient facts, sharpening others. By the time it reached me through secondhand channels, I barely recognized myself in it. At work, my life kept moving forward in ways my parents couldn't see or control. I was given more responsibility, trusted with projects that mattered. One afternoon, my manager pulled me aside and told me I was being considered for a promotion later in the year. I thanked him, nodded, went back to my desk and then sat there for a long moment staring at my screen, feeling a swell of something that was part pride, part disbelief. I hadn't told my parents about my job when I got it because they hadn't asked. Now, I realized they would have had no idea how wrong their assumptions about my finances and stability were even if they had asked. The false sense of powerlessness lingered, though. Even with legal backing, even with a growing sense of independence, there were nights when I lay awake replaying conversations, imagining future confrontations, wondering what else my parents might try. They had decades of practice at making me feel small. Undoing that conditioning wasn't linear. Some days, a single message from an aunt could undo hours of progress. Other days, I felt almost detached, watching the situation unfold like it belonged to someone else. The next major shift came unexpectedly, during a family gathering I hadn't planned to attend. It was a cousin's engagement party, held at a rented hall with cheap decorations and too much food. I debated skipping it, but something in me wanted to stop hiding, wanted to see what would happen if I occupied the same space as my parents without yielding. I arrived early, greeted people politely, kept my distance. When my parents walked in, the room changed. Conversations stalled. People glanced between us. My mother looked surprised to see me, then composed herself quickly, putting on her practiced smile. She approached me with a warmth that felt performative, hugging me a little too tightly, saying how good it was to see me. I returned the greeting without matching her enthusiasm. My father nodded stiffly, his jaw set. For a while nothing happened. We existed in the same room, orbiting each other, pretending this was normal. Then, during a lull in the music, my mother raised her voice just enough for nearby relatives to hear and said she was glad I had finally come around, glad we were working things out. I felt a ripple of attention shift toward us. I corrected her quietly, telling her that wasn't true, that nothing had changed. The smile on her face froze. She said she didn't want to get into it here. I told her I wasn't either, but I wasn't going to let her misrepresent things. A few people nearby pretended not to listen while clearly listening. My father stepped in, his voice low but edged with irritation, telling me this wasn't the time. I agreed. I said it hadn't been the time to call the police either. The words hung there, unmistakable. There was a moment of silence that felt longer than it was. Someone cleared their throat. My mother's face flushed. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she seemed unsure of what to say. The narrative she'd been relying on didn't work in this setting, not with witnesses, not with me refusing to play along. I excused myself shortly after, my hands shaking slightly as I walked out, my heart pounding. It wasn't a victory exactly, but it was something else. Proof. In the days after, I heard about that moment from 3 different people. Each version was slightly different, but the core was the same. People had noticed. People had questions. One relative told me privately that they hadn't realized things were that bad. Another admitted they'd been uncomfortable with how my parents talked about me but hadn't known what to do. None of them apologized outright, but their tone had changed. The isolation I'd felt began to crack just a little. My parents, on the other hand, reacted with fury. My father sent a long email accusing me of humiliating them, of airing private matters in public. He said I had crossed a line. I read it once and didn't respond. My mother followed up with a message that oscillated between guilt and threat, saying she didn't know how we could recover from this. For the first time, that idea didn't scare me. I didn't want to recover something that had been built on control and silence. What I didn't know yet was that their anger had pushed them into a mistake. In their rush to reassert control, to regain the upper hand, they had begun to contradict themselves in ways that were becoming harder to ignore. Different versions of the story were circulating simultaneously. The police involvement, once framed as a concerned check-in, was now being downplayed or denied depending on the audience. The legal letter was alternately described as a misunderstanding or my overreaction. These inconsistencies didn't matter when I was alone and doubting myself. They mattered when there were witnesses. I started documenting everything more carefully, not out of fear now but out of habit. Dates, messages, summaries of conversations. It felt strange, almost clinical, but also grounding. Each note was a reminder that this wasn't just a feeling or a memory that could be rewritten later. It was a record. I still didn't know how or when it would matter, only that it might. By the end of that week, I realized something else had shifted. I was no longer waiting for my parents to stop. I was no longer bracing for the next blow. I was living my life and letting their reactions exist on the periphery. That didn't mean it was easy or painless. It meant the center of gravity had moved. The power they had always assumed was theirs by default was now conditional, dependent on my participation. And for the first time, I was seriously considering what it would look like to withdraw that participation entirely, not as punishment but as self-preservation. The mistake my parents made didn't announce itself right away. It unfolded slowly, through overlaps and contradictions that only became visible once I stopped trying to manage their reactions and started paying attention to their behavior. The more I stepped back, the more they filled the space with noise. My mother began sending messages that assumed a familiarity we no longer had, updating me on family matters as if nothing had happened, then following them with pointed comments about how everything could go back to normal, if I would just cooperate. My father alternated between icy silence and sudden bursts of indignation, forwarding articles about respect and obligation without commentary, as if the implication were obvious. I didn't respond. That, more than anything else, seemed to unmoor them. About a month after graduation, I received an email from the same law office that had sent the earlier letter, but this one was different. It wasn't addressed to me directly. It was a group email accidentally sent, including me, my parents, and someone else whose name I didn't recognize at first. The subject line referenced a follow-up regarding funds. I read it carefully, my pulse quickening. In the body of the email, the attorney asked my parents to clarify which account the disputed funds had originated from, noting that earlier statements referenced both a loan and a gift, which would require different documentation. The tone was neutral, professional, but the implication was clear. Their story wasn't consistent enough to proceed. What struck me most was the reply from my father, sent less than 10 minutes later. He wrote that the money in question had never actually been transferred, that it was expected based on prior family arrangements, that my refusal constituted harm regardless. Reading that sentence, something clicked into place. There had never been money. There had never been a transaction. This wasn't about recovering anything. It was about forcing compliance, about asserting authority by any means available. They had gone to the police, then to a lawyer, not to reclaim something tangible but to remind me of my place. I forwarded the email chain to my lawyer. She responded within the hour, saying this clarified matters significantly. She pointed out that my parents had now put in writing that no funds had ever been transferred, undermining their earlier claims. She advised me to continue not engaging directly and let her handle any further communication. The calm confidence in her message settled me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. For weeks I had been reacting emotionally even when I tried not to. Now there was a framework, a process that didn't depend on my parents' moods. Around the same time, my job situation shifted again. The promotion my manager had mentioned became official, effective immediately. Came with a title change, a salary increase, and, unexpectedly, visibility. My name started appearing on internal announcements. Colleagues I barely knew congratulated me in passing. One afternoon, my manager asked if I would be willing to represent our team at an upcoming regional conference. I said yes without hesitation, then sat at my desk afterward feeling a quiet sense of disbelief. This was the life I had been building while my parents were busy rewriting narratives about me. I didn't tell my family about the promotion. I didn't feel the need to. But news has a way of traveling, especially when people are already watching. A distant relative who worked in a related field mentioned seeing my name on a program. An aunt congratulated me at a small gathering, her tone tentative, as if unsure whether this was something she was allowed to acknowledge. I thanked her, kept it brief. Later, I heard from my uncle that my parents had been surprised by the news. They had assumed, he said, that I was struggling more than I let on. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so familiar. The next confrontation came not from my parents directly, but from a setting they couldn't control as easily. A larger family event was planned, one that included relatives from out of state, people who hadn't been immersed in the ongoing drama. I considered skipping it, but something in me wanted the truth to exist in that space, unfiltered. I arrived with the same calm I'd been cultivating, greeted people, answered questions about work and life without defensiveness. When my parents arrived, I noticed how their confidence faltered slightly, how they scanned the room as if gauging what people already knew. It was my father who made the mistake this time. During a conversation that included several relatives, he referenced the money issue in vague terms, implying that I had caused unnecessary legal trouble by refusing to cooperate. He expected, I think, that I would stay silent, that I would let the implication hang. Instead, I asked him evenly what money he was referring to. He stumbled, said it was complicated. I said I was confused because according to his own lawyer, no money had ever been transferred. The room went very quiet. My mother tried to intervene, laughing lightly, saying this wasn't the place. I agreed, then added that it also hadn't been the place to involve the police over something that didn't exist. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I stated facts that were already documented. A cousin asked what I meant. I explained briefly that my parents had filed a police report claiming I was withholding funds, then later acknowledged in writing that no funds had been transferred. I said it calmly, like I was explaining a scheduling mix-up. The reaction wasn't explosive. Didn't need to be. People exchanged looks. Someone said they hadn't realized it had gone that far. Another relative asked why the police were involved at all. My father's face tightened. My mother looked stricken, her usual composure slipping. For the first time, they couldn't redirect the conversation without contradicting themselves. The version of events they had relied on collapsed under the weight of simple questions. After that, things moved quickly in a way that felt almost anticlimactic. My parents left early, citing a headache. In the days that followed, I received a flurry of messages from relatives checking in, asking for clarification, offering quiet support. No one was dramatic about it. No one declared sides. But the tone had shifted decisively. The story my parents had been telling no longer held. Too many people had seen the cracks. Legally, the situation resolved itself soon after. My parents' lawyer sent a final email stating they would not be pursuing the matter further. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. There didn't need to be. The withdrawal was enough. The threat that had loomed over me for weeks evaporated, leaving behind a strange, echoing quiet. When my lawyer forwarded the message, she added a note congratulating me on handling a difficult situation with restraint. I sat with that for a long time, letting it sink in. The last message I received from my parents came a few days later. It was from my mother. She wrote that she hoped, in time, we could move past this, that families make mistakes, that she missed me. There was no mention of the police, the lawyer, the money. The invitation was clear. Forget, reset, return to the old dynamic. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish them, but because I finally understood that responding would mean pretending none of it mattered. What surprised me most in the aftermath was the calm. I had braced myself for fallout, for grief, for a sense of loss that would hollow me out. There was some of that, yes, but it was quieter than I expected, less consuming. In its place was something steadier. I had seen the limits of their power, not in theory but in practice. I had watched it dissolve when exposed to documentation, witnesses, and my refusal to play along. The leverage I had built over years of quiet independence hadn't been flashy or dramatic. It had simply existed, waiting for the moment it was needed. After everything settled, after the emails stopped and the phone stayed quiet for longer stretches of time, I realized how much of my energy had been going toward managing my parents' reactions, even when they weren't actively doing anything. There was a kind of emotional muscle memory that didn't switch off just because the immediate threat was gone. I still caught myself bracing before checking messages, still felt a flicker of guilt when I thought about milestones I hadn't shared with them. Undoing that took time. It required me to notice when my thoughts defaulted to their perspective and gently redirect them back to my own. I started making small, deliberate changes. I stopped attending events out of obligation alone. I limited conversations with relatives who relayed my parents' opinions as if they were neutral facts. I didn't announce these boundaries or explain them. I just lived inside them. The people who respected them stayed. The ones who didn't drifted away. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, and in that quiet my life began to feel more like it belonged to me. Work became an anchor. The conference my manager had asked me to attend turned out to be a turning point I hadn't anticipated. Standing in a room full of professionals, talking about projects I had led, answering questions with confidence, I felt a sense of legitimacy that had nothing to do with my family's approval. When someone asked where I was from, I answered simply without qualifiers or disclaimers. For the first time, my identity didn't feel like something that needed defending. It just was. News of my promotion and increased visibility eventually reached my parents more directly. I knew because my sister called, her tone different this time, less accusatory, more uncertain. She congratulated me, then added that Mom and Dad were proud, that they had always known I would do well. The words landed strangely, not as comfort but as confirmation of how easily they rewrote history. I thanked her and changed the subject. When she tried to steer the conversation back toward reconciliation, I told her I wasn't ready to talk about that. She didn't argue. That too felt like a small shift. What became clear over the next few weeks was that my parents were struggling with the loss of narrative control more than the loss of access to me. They tried to reinsert themselves indirectly, asking my sister to pass along messages, suggesting family dinners, floating the idea of starting fresh. Each attempt carried the same unspoken condition, that I would return without addressing what had happened. I didn't take the bait. I wasn't angry. I was simply done pretending. There was one final moment that crystallized everything for me. I received a message from a family friend who had known me since I was a child. She said she had heard bits and pieces of what had happened and wanted to check in. We met for coffee and she listened as I explained briefly without the emotional charge that had colored earlier retellings. When I finished, she nodded and said something that stayed with me. She said, "It sounds like you grew up and they didn't know what to do with that." There was no judgment in her voice, just observation. Hearing it framed that way stripped the situation of its drama. It wasn't a battle or a betrayal in some grand sense. It was a mismatch between who I had become and the role they wanted me to keep playing. I thought back to the graduation day, to the empty seats, to the text message that had reduced years of effort to a single line. At the time, it had felt like a culmination of neglect, a final confirmation that I didn't matter as much as I wanted to. Now I saw it differently. It was the moment the illusion fell away. The moment I stopped waiting for something they weren't capable of giving. My parents did eventually send a joint email, carefully worded, suggesting that perhaps mistakes were made on all sides, and that they hoped we could move forward as a family. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I was likely to get. I read it once, then archived it. I didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because I had learned that closure doesn't always come from mutual agreement. Sometimes it comes from clarity. I began to talk about the situation more openly with people I trusted, not as a confession or a plea for validation, but as part of my history. Each time it lost a little of its charge. It became something that had happened, not something that was still happening. That distinction mattered. It meant the story no longer had the power to define my present. There were moments of sadness, of course. Holidays felt different. Achievements felt quieter without the familiar ritual of calling home. But alongside that was a sense of peace I hadn't expected. I was no longer performing gratitude or loyalty out of fear. I was choosing my relationships deliberately, based on respect rather than obligation. The strangest part was how ordinary everything became. Without the constant emotional turbulence, my days were steady, almost boring. I woke up, went to work, came home, made plans with friends, thought about the future. The drama that had once consumed so much mental space receded, replaced by practical concerns and small joys. It made me realize how much of my earlier life had been shaped around managing instability I hadn't caused. I didn't declare no contact or issue ultimatums. I didn't make speeches or demand apologies. I simply stopped centering my parents in my decisions. When they reached out, I responded on my terms or not at all. Over time, the distance became normal. The fear that had once accompanied the idea of disappointing them faded, replaced by a quiet confidence that I could survive their disapproval because I already had. As I moved further into this new phase, I understood that the real reversal of power hadn't happened in a single public moment, though there had been those. It had happened internally when I stopped measuring my worth against their reactions. The police report, the legal threats, the public exposure, they were symptoms, not causes. The cause had always been their need for control and my gradual refusal to surrender it. By the time the dust fully settled, there was nothing left to prove. I had my life, my work, my boundaries. The story that began with humiliation ended not with revenge but with perspective. I didn't need them to understand or agree. I needed to understand myself. And in doing so, I had finally stepped out of the shadow I'd been living in for as long as I could remember. The last thing that changed wasn't external at all. It was the way I remembered my parents. For a long time, even after everything that had happened, I still carried an internal version of them that felt larger than life, authoritative, capable of shaping outcomes just by deciding something was so. That image had been built over years of dependence and fear, reinforced every time I swallowed my feelings to keep the peace. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, that image began to shrink. Not because they apologized or grew, but because distance stripped away the illusion. When they no longer had access to my daily life, their opinions lost their immediacy. They became voices from the past rather than forces in the present. Months passed. My life filled itself in ways I hadn't planned but welcomed. I moved to a better apartment closer to work, signed the lease without consulting anyone, felt a quiet satisfaction when I realized no one could question the decision. I framed my diploma and hung it in my living room, not as a statement to anyone else, but as a reminder to myself of what I had done without their support. Sometimes I caught sight of it in the morning before leaving for work, and instead of sadness, I felt grounded. Contact with my parents dwindled to occasional, surface-level exchanges. A holiday text. A brief update passed through my sister. They stopped asking for money. They stopped hinting at obligations. Not because they had changed, but because the tactics no longer worked. When control fails often enough, people either escalate or disengage. They disengaged. That, more than any confrontation, told me everything I needed to know. One afternoon, I ran into someone from my graduation class at a coffee shop. We talked about work, about how strange that day had been in hindsight, about where people had ended up. She mentioned seeing photos from the ceremony back when it happened and asked where my parents had been sitting. I told her simply that they hadn't made it. She looked sympathetic, waited for more. I didn't add anything. The moment passed, unremarkable. Later, I realized that would have been unthinkable for me a year earlier. I would have rushed to explain, to justify, to fill the silence. Now the truth stood on its own. The money, the original catalyst for all of this, became almost absurd in retrospect. $2,100 had never been the point. It was a test of obedience, a line drawn to see whether I would still step back into my assigned role when pushed. Saying no hadn't just protected my bank account. It had protected my future. Every boundary I held after that was easier because of that first refusal. I didn't become cruel. I didn't gloat. When relatives asked how things were with my parents, I said we were taking space. When they pressed, I changed the subject. I let people draw their own conclusions. Some drifted away. Others stayed. The ones who stayed respected the quiet strength of the choice, even if they didn't fully understand it. There was a moment late one evening when my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. It was brief. She said she hoped I was well. Nothing else. No demands, no subtext I could detect. I stared at it for a long time before responding with a simple, neutral reply. I didn't feel pulled back in. I didn't feel obligated to reopen anything. The conversation ended there. And for the first time that felt like enough. Looking back, the most painful part of the experience wasn't the police threat or the public exposure. It was the clarity. Seeing, without distortion, where I stood in my parents' priorities forced me to grieve something I had hoped might still exist. But grief, unlike denial, eventually resolves. It makes room for something else. In my case, it made room for peace. I no longer needed my parents to show up for moments that had already passed. I had shown up for myself. I had walked across that stage alone, felt the sting of absence and kept going anyway. Everything that followed grew out of that same momentum. The quiet life I built afterward wasn't flashy or vindictive. It was steady. It was mine. If there was any lesson in it, it wasn't about cutting people off or proving anyone wrong. It was about recognizing when love is conditional and deciding whether you're willing to keep paying the price. I decided I wasn't. And in doing so, I didn't lose my family so much as I stopped losing myself. The story didn't end with applause or apologies. It ended with a locked door I chose not to reopen and a future that no longer required permission. That was enough. They skipped my graduation like it didn't matter. Then they demanded thousands like I owed them. Calling the police was their last mistake. Family betrayal, graduation drama, revenge stories, Reddit stories, emotional justice, narcissistic parents, golden child, personal success. I want to be clear about something before I finish this, because it's easy to mistake distance for bitterness from the outside. What I felt once everything truly ended wasn't anger. It was relief. The kind that comes when you realize you're no longer bracing for impact. The kind that settles into your bones slowly, after years of tension you didn't even know you were carrying. For most of my life, my parents had been the loudest presence in my head, even when they weren't physically around. Their expectations, their disappointment, their approval or lack of it had shaped how I made decisions, how I spoke, how I measured success. When that voice finally quieted, the silence was startling, but it was also clean. Life didn't transform overnight into something perfect or cinematic. There were still long workdays, bills to pay, moments of doubt. But those moments belonged to me. They weren't layered with fear of parental judgment or the need to preemptively justify my choices. When something went wrong, I handled it. When something went right, I allowed myself to enjoy it without immediately wondering who deserved credit. That shift, subtle as it sounds, changed everything. I ran into my parents one final time that year, unexpectedly at a grocery store near my apartment. I saw them at the end of an aisle, my mother's hand resting on the cart, my father scanning a shelf. My first instinct was the old one, to tense, to prepare, to plan an exit. Instead, I stayed where I was. When we made eye contact, my mother smiled uncertainly. My father nodded. We exchanged brief greetings. They asked how work was. I said it was good. I asked how they were. They said fine. No accusations. No demands. No emotional hooks. After a minute, we went our separate ways. As I walked toward the checkout, I realized my hands weren't shaking. My heart rate hadn't changed. I felt neutral. That neutrality felt like a milestone. Later that night, I thought about how unimaginable that would have been a year earlier. Back then, every interaction had felt loaded, like one wrong word could trigger punishment or withdrawal. Now there was nothing left to trigger. The power dynamic that had once governed everything between us had dissolved, not through confrontation but through irrelevance. They no longer dictated the emotional weather of my life. I stopped thinking about the police report entirely. It became a strange anecdote, something that sounded almost fictional when I described it to people outside my family. The idea that my parents had tried to use law enforcement to coerce me over money that never existed felt surreal in hindsight. But it also served as a clear marker, a line I could point to whenever I felt tempted to second-guess myself. That was real. That happened. And I survived it by standing still. The diploma on my wall stopped symbolizing loss and started symbolizing resilience. I hadn't needed an audience to make it across that stage. I hadn't needed applause from the people who withheld it. The work was done whether they witnessed it or not. That understanding extended into other areas of my life. I stopped chasing validation from places that had never offered it freely. I invested in friendships that felt mutual. I let myself rest without guilt. My relationship with my sister settled into something distant but civil. We spoke occasionally, carefully. I no longer tried to bridge the gap on my own. I no longer absorbed blame to keep things comfortable. If she wanted a relationship built on honesty and respect, I was open to that. If not, I accepted the distance. That acceptance hurt less than constant disappointment ever had. Sometimes, people ask if I regret not reconciling fully, not forcing a big emotional conversation, not demanding an apology. The truth is, I don't. I learned that closure isn't something another person gives you when they finally say the right words. Closure is what happens when you stop waiting. When you stop organizing your life around a future version of someone who may never exist. I didn't need my parents to understand my pain for it to be real. I needed to understand it myself. What stays with me most from that entire experience isn't the humiliation or the threats. It's the moment I said no and didn't take it back. That was the moment everything pivoted, even though I didn't realize it at the time. Saying no didn't make me cruel or ungrateful or disloyal. It made me autonomous. And autonomy, once claimed, changes the shape of every relationship that follows. If you're reading this and seeing pieces of your own life reflected in it, I want you to know something. Power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it looks like calm. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like walking away without slamming the door. The people who benefit from your silence will always call your boundaries betrayal. That doesn't make them wronged. It makes them exposed. My parents missed my graduation. They asked me for money like my achievement was irrelevant. They tried to frighten me into compliance when I refused. And in doing so, they showed me exactly who they were when they didn't get what they wanted. That knowledge hurt, but it also freed me. I no longer build my life around the hope that they'll change. I build it around the certainty that I already have. And that's where the story really ends. Not with revenge, not with reconciliation, but with something quieter and stronger. A life that doesn't require permission. A future that isn't up for negotiation. A self I no longer abandoned to keep the peace. They skipped the one day that mattered most. Then tried to take what I earned anyway. Saying no cost me everything and saved me. Family betrayal, graduation drama, revenge stories, Reddit stories, emotional justice, narcissistic parents, golden child, personal success. If this story resonated with you, you're not alone. Subscribe to the channel for real stories about family betrayal, emotional justice, and quiet comebacks. New videos every day.